Where the gotcha might happen is if the commercial product that you are selling as a vendor of that open source project, if the reason to switch from an open source project to that commercial product is not compelling enough, then you end up in this weird situation where the CTO or the VP of engineering is thinking of build versus buy. So if you have given up enough value in the open source project and your commercial product does not really change the value proposition all that much, then as a CTO, I might actually think about, okay, let me just put in a couple of engineers on this and really make the open source project successful within my technical stack. So that's sort of like where we see a lot of companies kind of miss the boat, where they have either given out too much in their open source project that they cannot build a business on, or sometimes they have held back too much to the point that they don't get adoption of their open source project.
Welcome to Humans of AI, where we tell the real stories of those who are building an AI or making use of it in their daily lives. Today's guest is Sudip Chakrabarti, an early stage investor and partner at Decibel, where he focuses on enterprise and infrastructure companies. Before becoming an investor, Sudip was an entrepreneur and engineer, starting his first company when he was at Georgia Tech and his second while in business school at Wharton. He's been in venture ever since, with a particular focus on enterprise and open source companies. If you want to catch the latest episodes of the Humans of AI podcast, make sure to subscribe. Check out my free AI newsletter, Chaos Theory, and find me on social at Alex Chowmander. Now, without further ado, here's my talk with Sudip. All right. Hello, everybody. I'm here joined with Sudip. He is a partner at Decibel, and we're going to be hearing about his story, about how he's investing in all across the enterprise, but probably most interesting to me in AI companies, and just his thought process and how he's approaching this entire space. But before all this, Sudip, I'm sure myself and the listeners would love to hear just your own origin story, how you came to be and what sort of life experiences brought you to where you are today.
Hey, Alex, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. So in terms of my background, I'm originally from India, came to school here at Georgia Tech, promptly dropped out to do my first company. Didn't really go very well with my mom, but she was finally at peace with it. So that was my first foray into entrepreneurship, sold that company. And then I actually was a product manager for some time. Ended up starting a second company when I was in business school. That one we grew to several million in ARR and had another exit. Nicer exit this time than the first time. And then since then, for the last 10 plus years, I have been on the venture side. I have only focused on enterprise infrastructure companies. So that's all I do. So think of my focus as partnering with technical founders, building technical products for technical users. So that's really what my current firm, Decibel, also specializes in. We only invest in enterprise infrastructure, seed and Series A, and that's exactly what I have been doing for the last 10 plus years.
Could you share about why enterprise infrastructure as like the sole focus area for you and the firm?
Yeah, so it starts with the user and customer personas. So what we find is if you're building an enterprise infrastructure company, and let me also define what I mean by infrastructure. We actually put all the companies that are selling to CIOs, CTOs, chief security officers, chief data officers, and VPs of engineering in this bucket. And the user persona, the go-to-market motion, the reasons why these companies succeed or fail kind of are similar across all these different startups. Whereas this is very different if you pick a vertical SaaS like fintech or HR tech or marketing tech. You're selling to a very different kind of user personas, typically someone who doesn't have a deep engineering or technical background. So the go-to-market motions tend to be very different. And of course, consumer is a whole different beast. So at Decibel in particular, we strongly believe in bringing a lot of help to our founders. So we have a few different things that we bring to the table that I can talk about if you're interested, but we cannot do all of that for multiple different sectors. We have to pick a sector that we really are passionate about, and that's enterprise infrastructure for us.
I think there's a lot to be said about just the overall buying journey of how these CIOs or just decision makers who probably for sure are more technical or come from some engineering background, engineers themselves, and they now have control over some budget, have to decide which technologies, which platforms that their companies or their teams invest in. I guess, what are some of the gotchas that you've seen these people sort of say, like, hey, like I'm trying to make a decision, but I need to have XYZ sort of thing. What are some of those things from the enterprise buyer?
So let me give you a more specific example. So we invest in a lot of open source companies. So companies that are built on top of open source projects. And typically what happens is the engineering team within a particular enterprise finds out about an open source project, starts using it, starts getting value out of it. And then eventually at some point, it gets the product gets to a point where this VP of engineering or the CIO or the CTO kind of wakes up to it and says, okay, since half of my team is already using it and I need all these enterprise features, or I need reliability, I need security, I need robust support, let me go and find the vendor who is standing behind that open source project. I mean, where the gotcha might happen is if the commercial product that you are selling as a vendor of that open source project, if the reason to switch from an open source project to that commercial product is not compelling enough, then you end up in this weird situation where the CTO or the VP of engineering is thinking of build versus buy. So if you have given up enough value in the open source project and your commercial product does not really change the value proposition all that much, then as a CTO, I might actually think about, okay, let me just put in a couple of engineers on this and really make the open source project successful within my technical stack. So that's sort of like where we see a lot of companies kind of miss the boat, where they have either given out too much in their open source project that they cannot build a business on, or sometimes they have held back too much to the point that they don't get adoption of their open source project.
It's an interesting dynamic because, for open source, of which, right, I'm building semantic kernel and have certainly seen this firsthand, that you need to offer something to the developer community that's compelling enough to even get them interested, or at least command their attention, right? Because they're going to be dedicating their time, their energy, their working hours to building or taking a dependency on it. And if you don't offer enough compelling features or just things, a good experience, then they'll just move on to the next thing. I think what's very true about open source is that the attention span is very small, and people can often chase the next thing.
We actually have a rule of thumb around that. So we kind of believe that everything that you need to make an individual user successful, and when I say successful, I mean really make them look like a magician to their peers. So anything you need to make an individual user successful, you should release in an open source project. Anything the team needs to be successful, that should be held back as a commercial product, as a hosted service, whatever that might be. So again, it's a very high-level rule of thumb, but it typically works for most open source projects.
Well, one thing I'd love to hear more about is sort of the journey of yourself and how these sort of personal experiences of entrepreneurship have kind of guided your own thinking in terms of how do you evaluate, how do you source companies, how do you even consider different open source projects and saying, this one seems really good, has good traction. This one might be very popular in the moment, but probably is one that I might pass on. Well, first, like how does the entrepreneurship mindset from yourself come into play here?
Yeah, in a few different ways. First of all, I think for me, a lot of my interest and subsequently my research focuses on what problem are you solving for your customer. And that goes straight back to my days of, doing my own company. At the end of the day, it might be the most cool technology you're building, but if you're not solving a compelling customer problem, nobody eventually cares. So I think a lot about, is this open source project really solving a pain point that no one else is right now? And sometimes, I would even take on an open source project that might be solving a small pain point or a niche pain point. But if there are users that are really passionate about the problem, the company or the project is solving, and I can extrapolate that and think that the rest of the market might get there in 3 to 5 years, that's a great, investment opportunity, because the rest of the market probably hasn't opened up, whereas, a small group of passionate users are really filling that pain point. So that's one thing, customer problem. The second thing is I spend a lot of time, again, when it comes to open source project, in understanding the community and the quality of community. So there are a lot of open source projects out there. You'll see a lot of GitHub stars. You'll see a lot of, buzz. But at the end of the day, it might be like they're solving a problem that is not going to be an enterprise class problem eventually. And while those projects are great for, open source success, they're probably not great candidates for building businesses. So I spent a fair amount of time trying to understand, deconstruct the user community to the extent I can. Are there people in the community who are using it actively that are coming from enterprises or, like fast moving startups or just, technology forward companies? If I see enough evidence of that, that is another very strong signal for me. So yeah, those are some of the things I look for. Goes back to my own days of starting companies.
Well, I'm sure you have these battle scar insights to share to go into these evaluations or considerations with. So certainly very valuable. Well, I guess speaking of a buzz and like what's been happening probably more recently in the last year, it's just all this, the AI wave, right? And everything that's happening here. Could you actually speak from the investor point of view of just like, what has it been like just in the past, let's just call it 12, 18 months around? What have you been seeing come out from AI, and what has even interested / even concerned you personally?
It is a bit of a cliche, but I think, this very much feels like a platform shift to us. Maybe like, when cloud happened, maybe like when mobile happened, maybe like when internet happened. Again, I wasn't there for many of those platform shifts myself, but this one definitely feels like that across the board. And the reason for that is suddenly what we are seeing is, market segments that we felt had matured enough to the point that starting a new company didn't make all that sense. Like you take a lot of these, sub segments within the B2B market, and they were like maybe 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 incumbents. So starting a new company there didn't seem like all that a good idea. Now with this technology, suddenly it feels like you can actually go and disrupt those markets, because A, you can offer a completely different user experience and better in many cases. B, which is super important, you can actually offer a very different cost model. And a lot of these incumbents have spent years and years of building a technology stack that suddenly goes out of the window because a new startup can leverage, any of the foundation model APIs or, even the small models they might be able to build, and completely upend your technology stack that you have built for years. So between those two, for the last few months, it feels like many of the existing segments in the B2B market are now again up for grabs. So that is a huge shift. That has definitely changed the pace and the dynamic of early stage investment, as you probably know. And the second piece is, I think also what's happening is it has created need for next generation infrastructure products. So we barely had heard of vector databases, for example, a year ago. We barely had heard of RAG. We barely had heard of fine tuning. Now, suddenly with companies, trying to leverage AI for their own applications, you see their need to really, build or buy this next generation infrastructure. And that has created a huge momentum for obviously all these companies. And the third piece I would say that is really interesting that is being driven by AI is some of the areas, and particularly I mean services, for example. So a lot of services companies exist all around us. If you were to go and compete with them 2 years ago, you probably had to go and build a very similar company driven by human capital, driven by low margin businesses and scale. Certainly AI can disrupt that model quite a bit. you could go and build the next generation Accenture or Deloitte or Infosys or Cognizant with the product under the hood that is an AI-driven product with probably some human interface, human services on top. But your cost model, your margin structure is very different. So again, that has opened up, I think, a lot of opportunities in areas that are not traditionally has not been venture funded in the past.
Yeah, if anything, platform shifts create opportunity. They are catalysts of disruption, but it's also a lot of noise as well. And I think some people would categorize certainly the early half of, or the early 2023 as being a period of exuberance, like a lot of companies seemingly getting funded just because they have many stars on GitHub or something like that. I guess, how have you been applying a more discerning eye, or at least a more critical lens towards what's happening here, and even deciding what you or Decibel invests in?
Yeah, I've been talking about GitHub stars. I mean, there's a half joke, but it's kind of true. I think in a lot of the new projects, if you're seeing a GitHub star count, divided by a 10 easily to even have some kind of normalcy. So yes, I mean, a lot of these projects have really taken off in GitHub star count. But when you really dig deeper, you will see that a lot of those are not really deep projects. Like, they're not deep technical projects. And there are a lot of exceptions, by the way, don't get me wrong. But a number of these projects are probably like demoware that people start or people like or they talk about just because the idea is cool, but that doesn't mean the project is delivering. So I think one thing that we have seen quite a bit is building a demo in this space has been fairly easy, but building a product has been extremely hard. And we keep talking about this last mile in AI, and that last mile has been really, really tough. So like, we try to really obviously find out what you're building. Is this wrapper on some foundation model API, or is it a really impactful technically novel thing that you're building? So that's one thing we spend a lot of time on. I would say the other thing is, like, we spend a lot of time on who the founders are. At the end of the day, like any venture investor you ask probably would say, okay, team is the number one, number two, number three priority. I think it's even more important in this new space because this space is moving so fast that you really need to partner with people who are technically the best, who have the openness to read the market, shift their ideas as needed. So that's why, like, we really like teams who are, first of all, technical, but also have a really good appreciation of, hey, the world might not look like what it is today 6 months down the line. So people who are like open to kind of seeing how the world is evolving and kind of moving accordingly. So that's why, like, we spend a lot of time really trying to understand who the team is. So yeah, I mean, again, we don't have a perfect crystal ball, but we have been somewhat more deliberate about who we partner with, what kind of ideas we partner with. And the last thing I would say is there are a lot of companies out there that have raised a lot of money to go and buy just GPU compute. And I think we kind of like companies that have figured out some creative ways to get around that GPU divide. So we kind of keep saying, like, okay, there are some companies that will be GPU rich, meaning they will raise a lot of money and probably go and buy a lot of NVIDIA cards. And then there will be a whole set of companies that will be GPU poor and try to figure out how they can still build their first application and deliver delightful customer experience without going and building their own models. So we tend to kind of like people or companies that have been a little more creative around, okay, it's not a direct funnel to NVIDIA's top line. Like, you don't raise a venture round and half of it directly goes out of the door to NVIDIA. So again, that's like something we like to see.
Yeah, one of the things I've been seeing recently is this idea of a GPU reseller of people just like taking this capacity that they've bought with venture money and saying, I'm just going to put it back out there, put a little, charge a little bit more and add some additional software or services on top of it. And then because there's just so much demand for
Right.
these A100s or H100s. It's just there's now a market for this type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, one thing that you brought up is, because I thought it was actually very interesting, but I'd like to double click on some more, is this idea that the services industry could be transformed and just even reimagined. Part of this is actually, you might have an opinion about this, is this rise of agents as a kind of direction or a pattern, if you will, or even just a new paradigm for having AI be able to not only reason, not only be able to gather information and synthesize it, but then actually take action and do things that a normal person, a human would do. So I guess first off, the question is, what do you think about agents as a concept? Is it more hype than reality? And is it a part of this transformation of the services industry that you were mentioning before?
It is definitely part of that. I think, we are far from a state where, agents do everything for us. And I actually don't even know if we'll get there. I do think, it will be a model where, as a human being, let's say you're in a specialized job, let's say you're a SOC analyst. I mean, basically you're sitting at the security operations center and you are monitoring all the alerts that are flying in, and then you need to go and investigate probably the top, 100 alerts, that day. So today, what your life looks like is when you have a high priority alert come in, you go and access, data from probably 15 different security tools. And then once you have that data, you basically try to connect the dots and then really decide on how to remedy it. I think you could potentially imagine a world where, you have lower level agents that can go and do the data acquisition for you, so that you're not logging into each tool or going into every tool and really trying to get the data. So I think, and then once you have the data, then the human being can make a much better decision of, okay, what the remediation steps should be. So I feel like you'll see a lot of these, agents at a granular level. I think we are far from getting anywhere in terms of a high level agent. Like, you can't really automate a SOC analyst, anytime soon. I don't think the technology is there. I don't think the trust factor is there. But I do think, it's sort of like, how, if you go back to the computer architecture, right? It's like today you program in a very high level programming language. You are not going and programming what goes into a register and what comes out of it, right? So I think, agent architecture will probably look something similar, where you will have a lot of this granular lower level agents, and then probably you'll have programming framework to build on top of those for your own customer use cases.
From my side, I view the agents as a pattern, right? As a way to kind of express like, hey, we want to give an AI the ability to have access to some tools, to do some longer term planning or longer term reflection, and be able to synthesize sort of observations it's making. And then, maybe take a few actions here and there to sort of step in one direction or another. I actually am I've become most interested in the multi-agent concept, and this was popularized by a recent open source project from Microsoft Research, AutoGen, where you could spin up multiple conversational agents that are all kind of off doing their own thing. They each have their own set of like skills or tools, and then they eventually kind of come back together, kind of share their work, share their insights, similar to, I guess, how a team would, right? And then the output from that would be better than any individual agent
Right.
would. So I think there's definitely some promise there. But when I talk to enterprises, when I hear about their willingness to embrace agents, well, first of all, they're just trying to embrace OpenAI, just trying to embrace large language models in the first place, and dealing with just non-determinism overall, and like not sure. Well, not even having the token budget to really explore agents in any meaningful capacity.
I agree. And I also think, a lot of this automation doesn't have to be super fancy. I think you get a lot of value even by automating, things that are mundane. People don't really enjoy doing it, and the more constrained it is, the better it is for obviously the AI to deliver something that works. So I feel like we'll continue to see a lot of that. I think you talked about hype. I think we definitely have seen in a number of open source projects that promise, oh, you can automate away this whole complex task, and typically they don't really. I mean, they kind of fall flat beyond a certain planning stage or something like that. So yeah, I have some skepticism about it for a high level complex task automation standpoint. I think you will have the human in the loop for quite some time, the way I see it.
Well, and speaking of this, what people are maybe hyped about, where there's a lot of attention, a lot of energy towards, there's this other side of the house of like, what are people not talking about, not thinking deeply enough about in AI? And I mean, Sudip, I'm curious to hear, as an investor, as a VC, you will see many different sort of pitches, many sort of different companies coming to you. Maybe all of them start sounding very similar to one another, but there could also be other ones that take a truly contrarian, truly different point of view. I'm just curious, like, are there any that are delving into the areas of stuff that people aren't really talking about in AI?
That's a good question. I wouldn't say this is not something people are not thinking about, but I would say we have started seeing entrepreneurs go after the security aspect of AI, and that kind of is an all-encompassing in a bucket. So there's obviously, how do you think about the new attack vectors now LLMs present, and how do you go about protecting those? So for lack of better analogy, think of it as an LLM firewall, right? So you really try to filter what is going into the LLMs through the prompts and so on. And there can be attack vectors like prompt injection and whatnot. And then also like on the output side, you filter what's coming out so that you are not serving up, toxic results or, really things that the LLM should not be, putting out. I think, individual foundation model companies actually are doing a good job, and they're probably going to do an even better job. So I do not worry as much about putting something like this on an OpenAI API. But I think we'll get to a world where there will be these 4, 5, 6 large models or foundation models, right? And then I think you will have this thousands of small models for your verticalized use case. Because those models will perform better than a generalized model. B, they will be cheaper to train as well as to run inference on. And C, they are probably built on your private data as an enterprise. So for those kind of use cases, I think security becomes more important, because how do you protect those models from attacks as well as putting out things that are undesirable? So I think LLM security is something people are waking up to it, and I wouldn't call it a contrarian bet, but I think it is something that is coming a bit late and will be in the focus pretty soon.
Yeah, I think oftentimes security, at least how people respond or react to security, is unfortunately a secondary item for many people. And it's only until after they're exposed or after they've experienced some huge negative consequence do they start saying, okay, we have to invest in something. We have to show face that we care about this.
Right.
But if anything, there's an opportunity for providers and even just users, enterprises to take a leading effort here. Well, as we are wrapping up, one thing that I'd love to hear about is just, we talk about the future of what it could possibly look like, certainly in the enterprise space, but even more broadly speaking, Sudip, I'm curious to hear, is there anything that you're just personally excited about to just see, like something that's happening or some trend that is going in the right direction?
Yeah, I think, look, I mean, this is coming from my own bias, but I kind of very much believe that anything that is open, transparent, community driven eventually trumps something that is closed, guarded behind the firewall. And this is a trend. It is not a done deal yet, but I feel at a guts level that when it comes to, foundation models from proprietary vendors versus models that are coming out of the open source community, I very much like the trend of how open source models are really getting better. Now, it's not a trivial task because you need the compute, you need the community to really, get behind it. But I very much like the trend of, where things are going. I don't think I was this optimistic even when ChatGPT came out last November. It felt like we might be moving to a world where, okay, we all work for OpenAI in one form or another. I actually feel very different now. And I feel like, the open source community has come together. Obviously, we need to do a lot more. Where I think the world will be, sure, you should use OpenAI when it makes sense, but when it does not, there are other open source alternatives for you. Actually, that's something I'm very excited about.
Yeah. Well, in the spirit of sort of creating this community, one thing I appreciate from Decibel, and it's probably the chance to explain more for the listeners what Decibel is and how you all invest. But one thing I appreciate is just, this emphasis on community, on talking with founders, highlighting them, spotlighting them, and even engaging in maybe some tougher conversations around like, okay, what is your go-to-market plan? What is your strategy for there? But do you want to share maybe for the listeners very quickly, Decibel, how you guys are investing and why founders should choose you?
Right. No, thank you for asking that question. So, as I said already, we are specialists. So we very much believe that post-investment, if we really want to help a company and make it succeed, the only way to do that is by bringing impactful help to the table. That starts with specialized expertise. So that's why we only invest in enterprise infrastructure, because that's all we know and understand and can help with. And the second part of that is we bring specialized services to the founders to really, increase their odds of success. And today that looks like four things. One is around really helping our companies build their community, build their bottom-up go-to-market machine, and sometimes even top-down go-to-market machine, and then really, help them get their product messaging, product positioning right. So that's like a big part of what we do as at Decibel. The second piece is finding them early customers, and for every company, every startup, customer obviously makes or breaks that company. So we spend a lot of time not only finding the right customers, but actually sitting down with the company on every call, try to understand how their message is landing, and if not, go back to the drawing board with them to increase the conversion. Then the third piece is talent. So we don't really focus a lot of time on C-level hiring because our companies are too early for that. We spend an inordinate amount of time helping them hire engineers, product leaders, developer relationship, and community people. And finally, there's something I would say I wish I had done even more for my own companies. I'm pretty proud of us doing this here. We spend a lot of time with our founders to really craft and refine their stories, like how they are talking about their companies to potential hires, customers, even investors, or to the broader world. So we spend a lot of time, designing their launch, designing their, voice outside to create a footprint out there that really, speaks to what they are doing, and which is really important when you're a two-person startup taking on Goliath in whatever space you are in. So I mean, those are the reasons why founders who really feel like they could use that help, get to product market fit faster, and hence they decide to partner with us.
That's awesome. Well, Sudip, thank you so much for coming on the Humans of AI podcast. If people want to reach out to you or find you, how could they do so?
Yeah, LinkedIn always works. And then my email is Sudip, Sudip @decibel.vc. And thank you so much for having me on this, Alex. It was fun.
Yeah. Well, for the founders, for anyone building an AI, I'm sure Sudeep will be happy to take your call, take your email. So,
Absolutely.
all right. Well, thanks again and have a good rest of the week.
Thanks. You too, Alex. Bye-bye.
Hey, thanks for listening to Humans of AI. If you're building something with AI or have perspectives you want to share, drop me a note at alex@humansofai.xyz. And be sure to subscribe to my newsletter, Chaos Theory. Until next time, this is Alex, Resident Chaos Coordinator.